My name is Riley Sterling, and I have spent my entire career restoring the fragile truth of history. But I never realized my own life was a carefully crafted forgery. I stood in a high-rise office in San Francisco today, my fingers tracing the cold mahogany of the conference table while the scent of expensive cologne and betrayal hung heavy in the stagnant air. Marcus Thorne, the estate attorney, cleared his throat with the surgical precision of a man about to deliver a fatal blow. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a flicker of professional pity before beginning to read the final wishes of my grandmother. Martha Sterling. My sister Bea sat across from me, her designer heels clicking in impatient rhythm against the floor as she adjusted the sleeves of her $4,000 silk blazer. She didn't look like a grieving granddaughter. She looked like a shark waiting for the scent of blood. Marcus leaned forward and announced that Beatrice Kensington would inherit the Nob Hill penthouse, valued at $3,800,000, along with the liquid assets totaling $950,000. Bea let out a sharp, jagged breath of triumph and smirked at me, her eyes gleaming with a malice she no longer bothered to hide. Then Marcus turned his gaze to me, his voice dropping an octave as he stated that I, Riley Sterling, would inherit the decommissioned industrial shipyard in Oakland. The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels like a vacuum before a storm. I felt the weight of the injustice like a physical pressure against my chest, but I kept my spine straight and my face a mask of stone. I looked at the legal document and realized my inheritance was nothing but a collection of rusted iron and crumbling concrete worth less than the taxes I would owe on it. Before I could even process the insult, my husband Logan stood up and crossed the room. But he didn't walk toward me. He moved toward Bea and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers in a gesture so intimate it felt like a slap. He looked me in the eye and said that I shouldn't be surprised, because a risk consultant always knows when to cut a bad debt. I stared at the man I had been married to for 7 years and asked if he really chose the day of my grandmother's funeral to announce his exit. Logan scoffed and told me that he had filed the divorce papers this morning because he was moving toward a future that actually had value. Bea laughed, a cold and melodic sound, and told me that my new shipyard was the perfect place to bury my pathetic failures. Marcus Thorne slid a small, wax-sealed envelope across the table toward me, claiming it was a private note intended only for the heir of the Oakland property. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, my eyes scanning the sharp, familiar handwriting of a woman who had spent 40 years auditing the sins of others. The note was brief and chilling, stating that when people believe they have taken everything, that is the exact moment you hold the power of life and death. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline as I realized the rusted scrap I had been given was a Trojan horse designed to dismantle their lives. I looked at the two traitors standing before me and felt a smile touch my lips for the first time. I gathered my things and told them that I hoped they enjoyed the penthouse. Because in my world, the foundation is always the first thing to collapse. The fog rolling off the San Francisco Bay felt like a wet shroud as I unlocked the rusted perimeter gate of the Sterling Industrial Shipyard. The air here tasted of salt and old grease, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-priced air of the Nob Hill penthouse. Bea was currently redecorating with my husband. I stepped into the main hangar, my boots echoing against the cracked concrete floor, while the wind whistled through the jagged gaps in the corrugated metal walls. My uncle Arthur Sterling emerged from the shadows near a massive iron forge, his face a map of deep lines and soot. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag and told me that he had been waiting for the day I finally held the key to this ghost town. I looked at the skeletal remains of ships and asked him if my grandmother really expected me to build a life out of this wreckage. Arthur grunted and led me toward the rear of the hangar, where a reinforced concrete wall stood apart from the rest of the structure. He tapped a specific section of the masonry and muttered that Martha never did anything without a layer of deception. He handed me a heavy, specialized mechanical key and told me that some locks require a conservator's touch rather than a sledgehammer. I inserted the key into a hidden seam in the concrete, feeling the tumblers groan and shift as 40 years of secrets resisted the turn. I pulled back a heavy iron plate to reveal a recessed wall safe, its steel surface gleaming under the dim light of my flashlight. I exhaled a shaky breath and whispered that I hoped there was more than just sentimentality behind this much security. Arthur stepped back to give me space and remarked that in his experience, the most dangerous things are usually kept in plain sight. I opened the safe to find no gold or jewels, but a meticulously organized collection of ledgers and a high-end encrypted hard drive. I pulled out the top folder and saw the letterhead of Kensington Interiors, my sister's firm, next to Logan's signature as a financial consultant. I scanned the first page and realized I was looking at a series of ghost invoices totaling $1,200,000 for materials that were never purchased. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I told Arthur that they weren't just sleeping together, they were laundering money through the family business. Arthur nodded grimly and noted that Martha didn't leave me a shipyard. She left me a gallows for the people who thought I was too weak to fight. I sat on a stack of timber and opened the hard drive on my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark hangar with a harsh, blue glow. Folder after folder revealed the systematic destruction of Riley Sterling, showing how Logan had moved $450,000 from our joint retirement account into offshore shells under Bia's name. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white and vowed that I would make them pay back every cent with interest. I looked at the evidence of their 3-year affair and realized their betrayal was a calculated business move designed to leave me with nothing but the debt. I turned to Arthur and said that they think I'm just an art restorer, but I'm about to show them how I restore the balance of power. Arthur leaned against the forge and told me to be careful. Because when you corner a rat in a penthouse, it still has teeth. I packed the ledgers into my bag and told him that the only difference between an heirloom and a weapon is how you hold it. I felt the weight of the shipyard shifting from a burden to a fortress as I realized I finally had the leverage to dismantle Logan's carefully guarded reputation. I told Arthur that I would be back soon and that he should keep the forge hot, because we had a lot of iron to strike while it was still burning. I walked back out into the Oakland fog, my heart beating with the steady rhythm of a war drum. I looked back at the house of rusted steel and whispered to the wind that they should have checked the foundation before they tried to bury me. My grandmother was right. When the world believes you are defeated, you are finally free to become the architect of their ruin. I chose the most expensive bistro in San Francisco for this meeting, a place where the waiters move like ghosts and the bill for a bottle of sparkling water could cover a week's rent in Oakland. Logan and Bea arrived together, looking like a power couple in a campaign ad, their coordinated arrogance filling the small booth. I took a slow sip of my water and told them I was ready to talk about a trade regarding the shipyard. Logan leaned back, checking his watch with a smirk, and asked if I had finally realized that owning a graveyard for ships was a losing investment. I looked at Bea and noted that the Nob Hill penthouse was spectacular, but perhaps a bit crowded for 2 people who had been hiding their lives for 3 years. Bea stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she set her designer clutch on the table like a weapon. She told me to stop being dramatic and asked if I was here to beg for a piece of her inheritance or just to waste their time. I leaned forward and whispered that I found something in the shipyard that belonged to Kensington Interiors, something involving a paper trail of $1,200,000. Logan's face didn't pale, but his eyes hardened into cold flint as he told me I should be very careful about making accusations I couldn't prove. I laughed softly and remarked that proving things was my specialty, as art restoration is really just the science of unmasking a lie. Bea scoffed and told me that whatever junk I found was probably just a senile old woman's ramblings and that I was nothing more than a bitter ex-wife. I tapped my phone on the table and asked Logan if his firm knew he was providing risk consulting for his mistress's shell companies while still married to their primary auditor. Logan hissed that he was a partner and that he decided what was a conflict of interest, not some woman who spent her days cleaning old oil paintings. I looked at B and asked how it felt to know that every vacation they took over the last 3 years was paid for with money stolen from my own retirement fund. B sneered and told me that she deserved that money for having to put up with my boring, pious presence at family dinners for nearly a decade. She leaned in and told me that she had been sleeping with my husband in our own guest bed while I was at the gallery, and that she enjoyed every second of the deception. Logan nodded in agreement and told me that I was a bad debt he had finally written off to move toward a more profitable future with a woman of his own caliber. I looked at them both and asked if they were truly admitting to 3 years of systematic embezzlement and a coordinated affair just to hurt me. B laughed and said that since I had no witnesses and no leverage, they could say whatever they wanted to my face without consequence. I smiled, a cold and hollow expression, and told them that in my line of work, we don't need witnesses when we have a perfect recording. Logan's smirk vanished as he realized the phone on the table was active, and he lunged for it, but I was already sliding it back into my bag. I told him to sit down before he made a scene in front of the city's elite and reminded him that a risk consultant should never underestimate the quietest person in the room. B's voice shook with rage as she told me that I would never get a cent of the inheritance and that she would tie me up in court until I was old and gray. I stood up and adjusted my coat, telling her that the penthouse was lovely, but I hoped she enjoyed the view while it lasted, because a foundation built on theft tends to sink very quickly. Logan tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back and told him that he had spent years assessing my risks, but he forgot to assess his own. I walked toward the exit and remarked to the hostess that the couple at my table would be paying for the $400 bottle of wine I had just ordered for them. The cool evening air of San Francisco felt like a victory as I walked toward my car, leaving them trapped in their own arrogance. I looked back through the window and saw Logan frantically arguing with B, their perfect partnership already starting to fracture under the weight of the truth. I told myself that the $1,200,000 they stole was just the beginning of the bill they were about to pay. I started the engine and whispered that the restoration of Riley Sterling was officially underway. And this time, I wasn't using a brush. I was using a scalpel. They thought I was a victim to be managed. But they were about to find out that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous auditor in the world. I drove toward the bridge, the lights of the shipyard waiting for me in the distance. A concrete sanctuary that was finally beginning to feel like home. I spent the next 48 hours in the shipyard office, the blue light of my monitor reflecting off the steel beams as I hit the send button on a series of encrypted files. By Thursday morning, Logan's world was already tectonic, shifting under the weight of an internal ethics investigation I had quietly triggered at his firm. I was inspecting a rusted winch when a black SUV screeched into the shipyard, Logan leaping out before the engine even stopped. He stormed toward me, his expensive tie flapping in the wind, and screamed that I had ruined his career by sending his private emails to the senior partners. I didn't look up from my work as I told him that a risk consultant who ignores his own moral hazards is simply a liability waiting to be liquidated. Logan grabbed a heavy wrench from my workbench, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and rage, and yelled that the firm had suspended him indefinitely without pay. He demanded to know how I accessed his corporate server, but I just smiled and reminded him that I had been his primary auditor for 7 years. I stepped closer to him, the salt air stinging my eyes, and told him that his biggest mistake was assuming my quiet nature was a sign of intellectual inferiority. Logan swung the wrench into a metal barrel with a deafening clang and hissed that he would sue me for every cent I didn't have for violating his privacy. I laughed and noted that under California's whistleblower laws, my disclosure of his $1,200,000 embezzlement scheme was legally protected and encouraged. The realization finally hit him, his shoulders sagging as he slumped against the hangar door, staring at the concrete floor as if it were his own grave. He muttered that B would never forgive him for losing his partnership status and the $400,000 annual bonus he had promised her. I wiped a smudge of grease from my thumb and told him that B's love for him was strictly a commodity, And now that his stock had crashed, he was about to be sold for scrap. Logan looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and asked if I was truly going to watch him lose everything we had built together since college. I told him that we ceased to exist the moment he used our retirement fund to pay for B's luxury lifestyle. And now I was just an observer of the consequences. Logan's phone buzzed incessantly. A series of frantic texts from B that he stared at with visible dread before looking back at me. He told me that she was panicking because the bank had flagged their joint business account for suspicious activity and frozen their liquid assets. I informed him that a formal complaint regarding conflict of interest usually triggers an automatic freeze under federal anti-money laundering protocols. Logan stepped toward me, his voice cracking, and begged me to tell the firm it was a misunderstanding so he could at least save his reputation. I looked him in the eye and said that I spent years restoring truth to art, and it was finally time to restore truth to my own life. I told him to leave my property before I called the police to report a trespasser with a history of financial fraud and a violent temper. Logan backed away. The man who once commanded boardrooms now looking like a discarded relic in a yard full of rusted iron. He pointed a shaking finger at me and whispered that I was a monster for destroying the man I used to love. I replied that the man I loved never existed. He was just a counterfeit I finally decided to unmask and incinerate. He climbed back into his SUV and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over the shipyard like ash after a long-awaited fire. I turned back to my laptop, my fingers hovering over the next file, and whispered that Wave 1 was complete. But the storm was only beginning. By Friday morning, the San Francisco fog had turned into a relentless drizzle, matching the cold precision of the tax audit I had unleashed on Bia's design empire. I was organizing the encrypted hard drive in the shipyard office when B's red convertible screeched to a halt outside. Splashing mud against the rusted hangar doors, she stormed inside, her $4,000 silk blazer ruined by the rain, and screamed that the IRS had just frozen every single account tied to Kensington Interiors. I didn't look up from my monitor as I told her that when you file $1,200,000 in ghost invoices, you aren't just being creative. You're committing a felony. B lunged across my desk, her face a mask of frantic desperation, and shrieked that she had a $500,000 payment due on a new property that she would now lose. I leaned back, my chair creaking in the silence, and remarked that Martha Sterling spent 40 years auditing the sins of people just like her. B slapped the desk and hissed that Logan was supposed to handle the risk management, but now he was suspended and couldn't even access his own email. I told her that Logan's risk management was always a joke because he was too busy managing his affair to realize his wife was his most dangerous auditor. Bia's voice cracked as she begged me to call my contacts and tell them the invoices were a clerical error so she could save her reputation. I laughed and noted that once the IRS Criminal Investigation Division starts digging, they don't stop until they find every drop of blood in the water. B slumped into a wooden chair, her arrogant posture finally collapsing as she muttered that she would be social suicide if the Nob Hill crowd found out about the tax fraud. I informed her that social suicide was the least of her worries, since the shipyard records also proved she had been using company funds to pay for Logan's offshore shell accounts. B looked at me with pure venom and asked why I was doing this to my own flesh and blood after all the years we spent together. I told her that family was a word she used only when she wanted to shield herself from the consequences of her own betrayals. B stood up, her fingers trembling as she pointed at me and yelled that I was just a bitter, jealous loser who couldn't stand her success. I stood up slowly, the height difference making her flinch, and told her that success built on theft is just a high-end forgery waiting to be exposed. I then dropped the final bombshell, informing her that the Nob Hill penthouse she inherited was actually tied to a $500,000 reverse mortgage Martha had secretly secured years ago. B's eyes went wide as I explained that she had exactly 30 days to pay the balance in full or the bank would seize the property. She gasped that she didn't have that kind of cash, because her liquid assets were tied up in the frozen Kensington accounts. I smiled and told her that it was a shame her future with Logan didn't include a contingency plan for a total financial collapse. B screamed that I was a monster for taking away our grandmother's home. But I reminded her that she was the one who traded her integrity for a designer lifestyle. I told her to get out of my shipyard and go find a lawyer who specialized in federal tax evasion. Though I doubted she could afford one now, B backed away, tripping over a rusted chain, and cursed my name as she retreated into the gray rain like a defeated animal. I watched her car disappear into the fog and noted that Logan was probably about to find out how quickly true love fades when the penthouse is being foreclosed. I turned back to the hard drive, my heart as cold and steady as the iron forge, and whispered that Wave 2 was complete. The shipyard felt like a fortress now, a concrete sanctuary where the ghosts of Martha's work were finally finding their voice through my hands. I realized that Logan and B were currently trapped in a house of cards that I had spent the last week systematically dismantling with a scalpel. I told myself that they had underestimated the woman who restores truth for a living. And that was a risk no consultant could ever survive. I pulled up the next file. A series of recorded phone calls between them discussing the embezzlement, and felt the final wave of the storm gathering strength. Justice wasn't just coming, it was already knocking on their door with a federal warrant. My grandmother was right. The best restoration is the one that reveals the rot beneath the gold. The fluorescent lights of the San Francisco Superior Court hummed with a clinical coldness as I sat beside my attorney, watching the final act of a 3-year betrayal reach its conclusion. Logan sat across the aisle, his once tailored suit hanging off a frame that had withered under the pressure of a federal indictment and a total career collapse. Beside him, B looked like a shattered porcelain doll, her designer vanity stripped away by the news that Kensington Interiors had been liquidated to satisfy a $1,200,000 tax lien. The judge reviewed the evidence I had meticulously restored from the shipyard's concrete safe, noting that the systematic embezzlement of $450,000 from our joint accounts was a clear violation of both marital and criminal law. Logan looked at me with hollow eyes and whispered that he never expected me to be so ruthless after everything we had shared. I looked him in the eye and said that I didn't create the fire. I just stopped pretending the house wasn't already burning. The court proceedings moved with the surgical efficiency of a guillotine, as the judge ordered the immediate seizure of Logan's remaining retirement assets to compensate for my financial losses. B let out a jagged, pathetic sob when the judge confirmed the Nob Hill penthouse had been foreclosed due to the unpaid $500,000 reverse mortgage. She stood up, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief, and screamed that I had stolen her inheritance and destroyed her reputation out of pure spite. I stood up to face her and remarked that Martha Sterling gave her the penthouse to test her greed, and she had failed that test in every possible way. B lunged toward the railing, but the bailiff stepped in as she shrieked that she was my sister and deserved more than a prison cell. I told her that she chose to be a co-conspirator instead of a sister, and now she could enjoy the exclusive community of a federal correctional facility. Logan's attorney tried to argue for a suspended sentence based on his client's previous clean record, but the prosecutor produced the recordings from the bistro, where Logan admitted to the affair as a business move. The judge shook his head in disgust and stated that a man who views his marriage as a bad debt to be liquidated deserves no leniency from the court. Logan turned to me, his voice cracking with desperation, and begged me to tell the judge that he was a good man who just made a few wrong choices. I adjusted my coat and told him that a good man doesn't use his wife's future to fund a mistress's shell companies for 3 consecutive years. He slumped back into his chair as the judge sentenced him to 8 years for wire fraud and embezzlement, while B received 10 for her leading role in the tax evasion scheme. As they were being led away in handcuffs, Logan tried to catch my gaze one last time, but I simply turned my back on the forgery of our marriage. I walked out of the courthouse and into the crisp, clear air of a San Francisco afternoon, feeling the weight of their shadows finally lift from my shoulders. The news cameras were swarming the entrance. But I navigated through the chaos with the calm of a woman who had already won the only war that mattered. I knew that Julian and Bea were currently heading to separate holding cells, where their perfect partnership would finally be incinerated by the reality of their crimes. I told my lawyer that the $450,000 they stole had been returned in the form of a court-mandated restitution, but the peace of mind was worth infinitely more. I looked toward the bay and realized that the Sterling shipyard was no longer a place of rusted iron, but a foundation for a life built on absolute truth. I hailed a cab and whispered to the driver that I was finally heading home to a place where nothing was a counterfeit. The restoration of Riley Sterling was complete, and the final result was a masterpiece of self-inflicted justice. The shipyard is no longer a graveyard of rusted iron, but a sanctuary of quiet, humming purpose. I sit on the pier as the sun dips below the Oakland horizon, painting the San Francisco skyline in hues of bruised purple and burning gold. The $5 million offer for the shipyard land sits on my desk, a figure that represents a life of absolute freedom I never thought possible. I decided to keep the core of the hangar, transforming it into a state-of-the-art conservation lab where the truth of the past is preserved with scientific precision. My grandmother Martha knew that I didn't need a penthouse to be powerful. I only needed the right tools to unmask the pretenders. Logan and Bea are now just cold file numbers in a federal database. They're vibrant, toxic energy contained by concrete walls and iron bars. I received a letter from Julian last week, a desperate attempt to explain that he was a victim of Bea's charms. But I fed it into the industrial shredder without reading past the first sentence. Some forgeries are so poorly executed that they aren't even worth the effort of a restoration. Bea's name has been scrubbed from the elite social circles of San Francisco, replaced by a cautionary tale of greed and spectacular failure. They sought to bury me in the mud of this shipyard, never realizing that I am a creature made of earth and resilience, capable of turning wreckage into a masterpiece. I walked through the Nob Hill district yesterday, passing the penthouse that now belongs to a private investment group, and I felt nothing but a cool, detached relief. The air up there always felt thin and deceptive, while the salt air of the bay feels honest, stinging the lungs with the reality of the present. I have learned that justice is not a loud, crashing event, but a slow, methodical reclamation of one's own soul. I am no longer the woman who bites her tongue at family dinners. I am the architect of my own peace, fortified by the secrets of a woman who saw the world for exactly what it was. The restoration of Riley Sterling is finished, and for the first time in my life, I am looking at a true original. Thank you for following Riley's journey. If you believe that betrayal within the family is the ultimate test of strength, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more intense stories of cinematic revenge. Your support keeps me going. See you in the next one.